Okay, I think we're about ready to start. Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming to day 2 of CoASP 8. We had a great day yesterday and we're looking forward to some awesome speakers today. Layla asked me to remind everyone that there's a suggestion bowl outside on the front desk, and she's eager to have suggestions and comments, preferably positive. So I'm going to be introducing the first 2 sessions this morning. So first up, we have the incomparable, the fabulous, the force of nature, Hilda Bastian. Hilda is a scientist, a blogger, and cartoonist who came into the field of science and scholarly publishing via consumer advocacy and citizen science. She's worked in Australia, Germany, and the US, and right now she's at the NCBI leading PubMed Commons, which is the commenting system on PubMed, as well as being the chief editor of PubMed Health, which is providing clinical effectiveness resources. She's also an academic editor at PLOS Medicine, and on the Human Ethics Advisory Board for PLOS One, and a blogger at PLOS Blogs. Although there's a lot of PLOS in there, but I'm sure you do things that aren't connected to PLOS occasionally as well. So today she's going to talk to us about her observations on pre- and post-publication peer review. It's going to be about 30 minutes of talk, and then we'll take questions afterwards for about 10 or 15 minutes. Thanks.
G'day. Can you hear me up the back? Thanks, Pete, although I really feel like it's only downhill after that introduction, but anyway, I'll do my best. I've uploaded the slides onto GitHub's speaker deck, and you can click through them. To find them, you can either find me on Twitter, which is my name shortened, @HildaBast, or just Google my name and you'll see my personal website, and they're right there. This is probably the most important slide. This is the one that says, this is going to be my personal opinion, and the views that I express are not necessarily shared by the National Institutes of Health or the US government, etc., although for some of them I actually think they should be. So you can see the problem right there, huh? In terms of disclosures, and in terms of what I'm going to say, Pete's already alluded to the fact that I'm involved with PubMed Commons, which has a clear position around openness and not allowing anonymity in post-publication commenting, so take that into account. In terms of thinking about the future, I think we're in a trajectory in science, but truly in science generally, in society generally, and probably in most parts of scholarly work and academy anyway, and research. Particularly in peer review, you can really see this reflected. It came really out of a process of a lot of individualism and a lot of secrecy. And we're on this trajectory from individualism to collaboration and from secrecy to openness in all sorts of things. It's just a historical arc that we're on. There can be backsliding and moving faster at some points than others, but this is where we're going. Peer review, particularly pre-publication, really has come from a very elitist, kind of behind closed curtains and a great deal of secrecy, even when there doesn't need to be. And I think that this is something that we're going to see change. This is just a few things just to give a general idea about, to argue why I believe that we're on this trajectory, and it really doesn't matter to some extent what these particular examples are. You could pick all sorts of ones, but what I've picked here is the rise of co-authorship. I've put it at about 1850 because it depends when you think the kind of pre-publication peer review that we have now started, but say it's around then. That was also around the time that science was really specialising and growing, and it was the beginning of co-authorship. The first genuinely co-authored article that I've been able to find was from 1870. By 1940, and you'll see that there was in the last century in there's just been this steady rise in collaboration in sciences measured by authorship. By 1940, 40% of articles were co-authored. And it was 2004 that the first article, it was a clinical trial, peaked over the 1,000 authors mark. And I've also put in Wikipedia there at 2001 after the internet to kind of show how, just how collaborative we're getting. With secrecy, it's a little bit different because a lot of that's really related to the internet. In terms of science and research, I've put in 1895, the rise of media attention because of Röntgen and the X-ray. Even before he presented that paper at the scientific meeting that he was going to, it had been on the front pages with the X-ray of a person's hand of newspapers all across the world. And that whole process of people presenting research findings at conferences with journalists there and all those sorts of things. An awful lot of openness about research results both before and after publication has arisen. I've chucked a few things on there that the internet just shows you. You could just infest this with masses of things that happened after the internet. But there's the archive in 1991. There's the Open Source Initiative for Software was 1998. I'd pegged open peer review really at 1996 for a few reasons. The Budapest Declaration's 2002. This is now moving really, really fast towards to enable openness in peer review. One of the things that we haven't had, quite astonishingly, given that this is a scholarly enterprise, is we haven't actually had much research about peer review or any of the impacts of the different things that people advocate for and claim about the effects of different parts of the publishing exercise. And in terms of closed, I've written a blog post looking at the evidence that I could find around this issue about anonymity in peer review. There's very little of it, but what there is nothing really to justify to any great extent the arguments that people make for the supposed benefits of double-blind peer review. That doesn't actually exist. Not in any great deal. There's only small impacts, if any, of both openness or of blinded peer review. So the arguments that people are going to make at this point, or that any of us make, are not really very strongly grounded in evidence. There's a couple of things, though, that are important. It does seem to be that open peer review people may be a bit more careful when their name is going to be on it and it's going to be known, especially if it's going to be published, whatever they wrote. They're going to take a bit more care. They may be less likely to agree to peer review because there's more consequences for them of having done it. They may be less likely to say, they may still be critical, but they may be less likely to say something really like, do not publish this article or whatever, but they'll still make their criticisms. And there's a bit of a possibility that some groups in the scholarly communities may be more nervous about open peer review, and that may particularly be in terms of gender and people who are for a variety of reasons, in less powerful positions. So I've come to a lot of concerns about that. I actually think that there are serious benefits, though, and that includes for women and for people who are perhaps very nervous about the issue of openness in peer review and criticising others. One of those is that I think it's inevitable that that it's going to be easier to hide conflicts of interest, or for editors and journals and whatever not to know what they are, and for that not to become apparent to people. It could be bias at journals, it could be conflicts of interest of peer reviewers, and so on. When we get to a place where it's more open, it's going to be more possible for people to actually expose this and identify that these things are problems. We're going to be able to see more, for example, which journals don't actually have that many women, for example, as peer reviewers. And when you look at the research about gender and peer review, you'll see this real concern for, do authors get a fair go, regardless of their gender? But one of the things that you see in this is that there's an enormous gender disparity in who's doing the peer reviews. And that may not end up having a big impact on the particular papers and how that process goes, but there are other really important outcomes here. And one of those is, what is the impact on people's careers who are not from the United States or from different cultural backgrounds, or who are women? What are the consequences that they don't have anything like that level of experience of this side of the kind of scholarly work world? I think that's potentially actually really quite serious. People have this real concern that you're going to damage your reputation because of being critical and so on. But I would actually argue that you can also build a reputation that way. I would say my entire career is built on criticising. And so is it for anybody who's a systematic reviewer, which is what my background is, either as a consumer advocate or as a systematic reviewer. Being critical is really the building block of my career. But I think that critical skills and analytical skills and the ability to articulate those criticisms is actually a core academic skill, and it's certainly a core part of science. Now this is a kind of like a picture now of all the different kinds of elements of what could be post-publication peer, what you could call under post-publication peer review. Publication is not the end of the road. It's just one of the things in the life cycle of some kind of project or research work most of the time. It's not an end in itself, and there's still a lot of aftercare that can be needed for a real lot of publications, and a lot of consequences that follow. People wanting more information and so on. You've got that process where some people just wait and put in their critiques of other people's research in the background or discussion of their next paper, but that's awfully slow, obviously. There is discussions around water coolers that people have at conferences, in journal clubs. There's all sorts of discussion and critique about papers that doesn't necessarily get captured. But people make a lot of claims about why there's nowhere near as much open critique as people who, like me, who are advocates of it, would want to see. And it's actually very hard. I haven't really seen any research at all that can really give you a real sense of what are the really big drivers here. From looking at the issue of post-publication peer review, of pre-publication peer review, you'd get the sense that the issue of time and so on is actually a fairly big one. That to not give it a whole lot of thought and dash a few thoughts together and not put your name on it, that's pretty quick and easy. But if people are actually going to see what you've got to say, then you're going to, by and large, take more time. So that could be part of it. People go to the issue of fear of retribution a great deal, and I think this is actually a very serious thing for us to talk about, but I don't think that that's the primary reason that people don't engage in post-publication peer review. But I suspect it's more those other things that I've got up here, like time, lack of confidence and motivation to do it and go through the effort that it takes. The debate often gets mixed up with issues around what I would sort of call whistleblowing and really, really serious problems that somebody might see and be genuinely very, very afraid of publicly dealing with it. But I don't think that the best way really to deal with those things is actually letters to the editor and comments and so on. There's a level where once there's something as serious as that, we've got an awful lot of problems in the system around how we cope with those things that no amount of letters to the editor or whatever is going to solve. I think that the future for both pre- and post-publication peer review should be both open and collaborative. It's almost, sometimes I get an invitation from a journal and a whole lot of stuff where you sit there and you think, they're so concerned about the secrecy and the confidentiality that you feel like you've got to, after you've printed out the paper, that you've got to chew it up and swallow it afterwards. And while there are times where secrecy is actually really quite important. In fact, I think we should be encouraging people to peer review in groups and say, if you're going to discuss it with your colleagues, that's great. We want to know who they are, but we should actually encourage it more. And I suspect that it's actually also part of the solution, potentially, to a lot of the other problems that we've got, because there's safety in numbers as well, both for learning how to do it, learning what's reasonable criticism, all of those kinds of things, and then having the confidence, because it's not only your name on it. There's an awful lot of, and there's a social process, so it's got something to do with motivation and all sorts of things. So I truly do think that it's a process whereby more collaboration would actually help, and more openness. To some extent, that putting your preprint out on archive or bioarchive is the ultimate expression of sort of that kind of a process, or speaking about it at a conference. I've put a couple of examples here that you could look up on PubMed if you wanted to see them. The first one is an example of huge publicity about somebody saying they found a genetic association with multiple sclerosis, just huge. Now, within a few days, this consortium had analysed a much, much, much larger data set with much, much more rigorous statistical methods. They put it on PubMed Commons. It was in, they uploaded the full analysis on bioarchive, and journalists and everybody else was starting to kind of look at this and go, okay, look, maybe this really isn't as big a deal as we thought. And we're seeing more of those kinds of things happen, of actually people, the account may be individual, but the comment is signed by a group of people. And I think that really is a sign of the future and where things should go, will inevitably go, because it's happening everywhere else. I think of post-publication peer review as having a yin and yang. There's the stuff that's about critique, but there's also a whole other side of putting in information for the questions that people have got, who might want to either try and replicate the study, or who want to put something into practice, or follow a method or whatever. There's only so much, even if it's a really large publication, there's still only so much that goes in there. And getting that out in the public domain so that other people can find it, and not just have those conversations by email in private and nobody else has access to that extra data, is really quite important. And what you see, that whole thing of people starting to connect one of their projects with another project, and here's more research, and if you're going to read this one, please read this other one, or we no longer believe this. That whole process of what Drummond or any used to call aftercare of a publication is actually quite a serious and important issue. I think of consequences as being more important, perhaps, at this point in time than the issue of incentives, which is one of the things that people raise a real lot when you get somebody like me who's an advocate of post-publication peer review and openness in all peer review. I think that we don't actually have that many incentives for pre-publication peer review, yet people do it. And there are all kinds of reasons that will motivate people for doing things. I think author engagement with post-publication peer review is a very, very serious motivation for other people to actually do it. If you really knew that the author was going to answer and that was expected, if you had an important question or you had a serious criticism, if it became expected all along the line, culturally and by funders and by everybody else, then the motivation to actually bother to take the time to put your thoughts in writing and marshal your thoughts really well and publish them become, the ante just goes up. And there have to be consequences of critiques, and I think we have to stop being as concerned about that as we have been. There needs to be that kind of, that people don't have to be as defensive, because it's clear that just because something is being published, it doesn't mean it's sort of been anointed with holy water or something. It's and a large amount of the things that we're going to do are going to require correcting or even retraction or whatever, and there just should not be as much stigma around it. But there should be consequences. There should be corrections, there should be retractions, these kinds of things. I think of it a bit as when I was a consumer advocate in hospitals many, many years ago, and you would have this process of people being concerned, if we develop this big complaint system, there'll be all these complaints and we'll look like a bad hospital. But in fact, that process of going, well, we know nothing's perfect, And to have a good, continually improving hospital, you need patients to complain about things. It's actually really quite important. And I think the same is true for science. I think there has to be consequences to authors of non-response to important questions and criticism. And I think that there should be more accountability. Thomas Südhoff has recently written something in PLOS Biology calling for more accountability for editors, reviewers and journals. And I think that that's actually really quite important. I would agree with a lot of the things that he said. PubMed Commons, I'm not going to say a real lot about it, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. If you have to be an author of something that's in PubMed, it could just be a letter to the editor, an author of anything that's in PubMed in order to be able to comment. We don't allow anonymous counsel pseudonyms. Whatever you post goes straight online, unless you've used something that the kind of filter for swearing and whatever catches. And then every single thing is moderated after it goes online. So comments are pulled and so on. And the comments come with a Creative Commons license. Now, there's about 1 million entries into PubMed every year. A large proportion of those are not research. But a lot of people argue just because the amount of post-publication commenting is low, that's a problem. I don't think it is. I don't think people, for a lot of that stuff, I don't even think people should necessarily be spending their time reading it, and we know that a lot of stuff isn't even read, much less spend time commenting on everything. I don't think everything should have post-publication commenting. The implications of that for the work that we could do is just quite mind-blowing. But I do think it should, in theory, be somewhere around the level, especially if we look at those issues about the positive things that I'm talking about people, about the aftercare of their publications. It should be at least the level that letters to the editor and errata and those kinds of things are, which means it should be upwards of 10%. And it's a lot less than that. PubMed Commons is about 1,500 publications get comments on them every year at the moment. And you'll see this happen with almost any kind of platform or process or anything at any kind of journal or whatever. It tends to get to some place and gets to this plateau, wherever it is. And the plateau is different for different people. And I think some things actually have to fundamentally change in order for that to shift. As I said, I think one of those things are author engagement. The author reply rate, we contact all the authors that we can find to let them know. We go to quite a considerable extent to find people, but we still only have a 6% author reply rate. There's no way you need 100%. I mean, there's lots of things that people say that just, somebody said your article's great. Well, you don't need to reply necessarily. 18% are women, and there's a few of those women are quite prolific. So this actually is better than some of the studies of pre-publication peer review that I've seen, but this is still clearly a problem. This thing about people linking to data or code is a really severe underestimate of actually how much extra data and so on is coming in the comments. So the value and the quality of what's there is actually really, really high. About 1 in 5 PubMed Commons comments is actually posted by the author. This is not author's replies. This is those things that I would call aftercare, or letting you know, here's the full text over here, or here's this blog post I wrote, or whatever. And I think that we have sort of issues about still deciding what we think the important metrics are. I don't think number of comments is it, because if one of the things that people in the scientific community and at NIH were really concerned about was that it would turn PubMed into YouTube, with kind of heaps of people just chatting backwards and forwards underneath and saying goodness knows what, and nobody wanted that. So I don't think the number of comments is really the most important metric. I think it's going to be issues about quality and what it is that they're commenting on, and who's commenting, and a whole lot of other kinds of metrics that we sort of really need to work on. One of the really biggest things that we're going to have to do, I think, is really change, continue to work on and improve our communication culture. because being more collegial is going to be central to a real lot of things. And I certainly think that it's part of what happens for certain cultural groups and for women as a gender. We've always had this history of people being pretty, sometimes even downright aggressive when they're criticised. That's been there since the beginning of science. Post-internet, some people are having a lot of problems with the whole world of the tweeters and the bloggers and that kind of process, and a particular form of aggressive communication that I think is actually really detrimental to collegial, just a collegial scholarly community, and it's something that we really have to deal with. The culture that we develop, we're developing it all the time. This isn't something static that we can't change. We're doing it in everything that we do, and all of our systems and all of our policies, and each of the decisions that we make create the cultures that we're, and microcultures that we're living in. And if we get more collaborative and more collegial, we're getting closer to having constructive, inclusionary engagement, because I think aggression, secrecy, elitism, all of these kinds of things are the opposite of what we really need. I had, at one point I got very ambitious about this and thought, well, gee, what we really actually need to do is target and knock out hubris in science and replace it with generosity. That would actually solve an awful lot of problems just right there. But I do think that the issue of culture change is something that is actually going to be needed if we're going to go from that place of comments in the 4-figure range of publications instead of the high 5-figure range, which is where I think it probably should be. And I do think that the future of science and scholarly work in general is going to be collaborative and diverse and open. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilda. So, any questions?
So, I'm Xenia van Edi from Copernicus Publications. Thank you very much for this really interesting talk. Maybe you know in Copernicus we do like pre-publication commenting kind of options. So the reviewer I have to post the reports openly accessible, but also the scientific community and others are invited to join the discussion. And what we basically experience is that there are some topics which are like hotter than others, and we have much more comments on them, while other papers only get 2 comments, which are basically the comments of the referees. So do you have a similar experiences in your post-publication peer review that there are papers which get a lot of comments and there are other which will never get any?
There is, I mean, what you tend to see is that there is a tendency for the critiques in particular to go towards things that are controversial and likely to be quite influential. And you'll see that same process. If you look at the literature, for example, on retractions, you'll see that it's more likely to happen often in the really big famous publications, and, because they quite simply get more attention. And also the consequences of those particular publications should be greater. So I don't think that that's entirely a problem. As I said, I think that issue of how much time people have got, I think it's often a shame. But I think there is a sort of a level of, in your ideal world, you would want to see certainly the effort about criticism. You'd like to see that the most, the things that actually should be criticised the most are the things that get criticised the most. And inevitably, because time is always going to be a constraint. But it is unfortunate that there's such an enormous disparity in what people pay attention to and what they don't. That really sucks, especially if it's your work and nobody seems to care. That is just awful. But that's again the point that quantity isn't everything.
You mentioned a few times that there wasn't much research about peer review and the interesting questions, and we all know about the black box of peer review. But it seems ironic to me in some respects that scientists who engage with an evidence-based process don't apply the scientific method to the process of communication itself. And how much, and there are issues around confidentiality and peer review. So how much do you see that opening up, and what responsibility do you see researchers having in being willing to expose their process of communication to independent analysis, and what role do publishers, do you think, have in this?
Yeah, thanks. That's really important. I think that openness is going to be part of the process, because the more open things are, the more people are going to some people are just going to do it. So some of those data are going to actually be relatively easy for people to get to work on. It's very difficult to know. I suspect we've got a huge publication bias in this area. I wrote a comment recently about something where somebody had made claims about peer review. And as near as I could tell at that particular point in time, there'd been probably maximum of 20 journals that ever published anything. I mean, you'd have to do a lot more of a systematic search than I had done, but nevertheless, there are tens of thousands of journals, really. Certain, depending on how you call it, that there's just these few that are responsible for all the published research. But think about it, like, you're really going to publish something, if you had looked at it, that said we have a major discrimination problem at our journal. It's kind of, we don't really know what people have actually done, or what processes of normal kind of quality assurance are embedded in their work. It is a black box, as you say. And I think that journals need to kind of be more willing to publish this stuff. But now there's several journals that actually want people to publish this kind of literature. I think that used to actually be quite a problem, that people didn't want to publish an article at their journal that criticises their competitors, that sort of thing. And I think we're past that now. So I think we're at that point where we need more of a discussion about what is it that journals should be doing internally anyway, for sheer just social responsibility and to be sure about the quality of what they're doing. And then we do need enough journals to actually start to become quite serious about participating in rigorous research, not just show and tell, really rigorous things about testing some of these hypotheses that we've all got.
Hey, so I'm Jennifer Griffiths. I'm with the Royal Society of Chemistry, and I appreciated your comment about the culture change, the going from hubris to generosity, I think it was. Mm-hmm. So how do we do that?
I think we have to get confidence that it matters, and that we're going to start to call it out and so on, and say this is actually a problem. I mean, one of the things that you sort of start to notice over time is that there's always somebody else who is going to do great work, and the number of people, the amount of kind of human ingenuity and whatever is fairly limitless. I think people have been too nervous, I think, about sort of calling out the parts of the culture that are actually diminishing to other people. And I think there has to be more of a consequence to that. I mean, if you are really, really famously terrible to people, and if there's bullying in the workplace and all of these kinds of things, those things actually have to be addressed. And the more of us that say we really care about these values and we're really going to be motivated to deal with those the individual times that we see it, because this all happens in individual moments and individual decisions, and I think that we just have to have more confidence in it. That a group of people recently were doing a thing about trying to develop what were the values of scientists, and it was amazing to me but the process that they were going about it in, with starting off with elite grantees of major organisations and that sort of a thing. And in one country, and thinking that that was okay, and those sorts of things. But also what they then specified. So, for example, openness and accountability wasn't even on there as a value. And so I think we do actually, I don't think those debates are trivial. I think we do have to talk about it more, and for people to feel the confidence, this matters, it's not okay to be awful to people.
Can I ask
Or to think I'm just going to send that peer review on no matter how aggressive and perhaps silly it is,
Can I ask just a quick follow-up question? So as far as you're talking about the comments and stuff, so how involved is the community in, you also mentioned that, having the community behind you and sort of the, peer pressure, getting people to do it. Do you have like a panel of scientists or anything that are like working with you to kind of try to change the culture, partnering, kind of like an editorial board almost that would be advising you?
Yeah, we have a group like that, but that was really more for in the formative phase of just doing it. And so we provide the platform and the service and the moderation and those sorts of things. And it's a very kind of highly developed system, but firstly, ours only covers PubMed. That's one thing, it's not some whole solution to everything else. But no, we're not putting a huge amount of time yet into that process of trying to encourage things. One thing that we're trying to do, where we are putting our effort into, is to say, because our resources are limited in that respect, is to try to get journal clubs to join. We have journal club membership as an option. And this is clearly the low-hanging fruit in this respect. This is where groups of people are engaging on a massive scale across all sorts. I mean, I actually think it really started in sort of philosophy in Germany and whatever, journal clubs, but it's across many fields, but it's massive in biomedicine and in biology, journal clubs. But unless you actually happen to be there in that discussion, that intellectual effort is just disappears, and there's no value to everybody else. So from our point of view, that trying to change the journal club culture to get people to think, yes, and then we do our summary, and then we put the summary on PubMed, and that's actually working quite well. The journal clubs are, once they join, they're more likely to comment. The quality is really high. They keep going. So that's actually the smallest thing to change in the culture in that sense, because it's something that's already happening.
Thank you.
Hi, Gunther Eisenbach from Jamier Publications. Do you have an API which would allow publishers to put the comments next to the article? Is this something you encourage? And if yes, have you seen any publisher implementations of this? And obviously, many publishers have already their own commenting system. So how do you see this vis-a-vis what you're doing? Is the final goal to encourage publishers to retire their own commenting system and only use this, or do you see this as complementary? Where do you see the advantages and disadvantages of having this system as opposed to a commenting system on the publisher side?
I think that there are, I do see it as more complementary. We don't have an API yet, we will. We sort of struggled with that for a time on account of we don't have pre-moderation, and then we pull quite a lot actually at certain times off. So that whole issue about how we would do the API, it's been a bit fraught, but we will do it. The reverse is not really an option because journals don't have the same criteria that we have. So they're not necessarily authors, or there are all sorts of issues about the reverse direction for us. And if it's a PubMed journal, we're linking whatever they've published as letters to editor. It's all actually meant to be incorporated in that one record anyway, linked in and so on. So. No, I see it as complementary, and you'll see part of that process of people using PubMed Commons sometimes because they had a comment and a journal had either didn't even accept letters to the editor, or only X months after the article got published, or their letter was rejected, so they cut and pasted into PubMed Commons. So I think that there's, and for the NIH, that's certainly important as a public funder of research. They want members the community to have unfettered ability to criticise research from the NIH. No matter what. And so that's just a sort of a form of infrastructure that just needs to be there, but it doesn't compete with change or reduce the importance of communities around journals and so on, and that process of editors fielding the letters and so on. It can't replace that at all. It's just complementary.
Okay, well, that's good timing. Okay, there's nothing else? Perfect timing. Thanks very much, Hilda. Fascinating.